Welcome to Forage Nexus, the podcast that dives into the heart of forage agriculture. I'm Marcelo, Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist and Associate Program Leader with the University of Florida.
And I am Bruno, Pedreira, Forage Specialist and Director of the Beef and Forage Center at the University of Tennessee. Our mission with this series is to capture the legacy of forage agriculture giants, to share the stories behind influential careers and inspire the next generation of forage scientists and agricultural leaders.
Today, we are proud to have here with us Dr. Q Quesenberry, honoring the legacy of his friend and mentor, Dr. Richard Dick Smith. Dr. Smith was born in 1936 in Mendota, Illinois. After finishing high school, where he played football and track, in 1954, he served the U.S. Army, stationed in Germany for 2 years. Then he went back to get his bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Illinois and PhD from Iowa State, joining the USDA-ARS in Madison in 1966, where he stayed until his retirement, transitioning to the Dairy and Forage Research Center until 1999. Dr. Smith revolutionized red clover breeding by improving its persistence and disease resistance, transforming it from biannual species into a valuable perennial forage legume with great impact in livestock production systems across the United States. He's also founding member of and chair of the Clover and Special Purpose Legume Crop Germplasm Committee, and through his leadership in national strategies for germplasm acquisition, conservation, and utilization, he collected over 570 new accessions of germplasm for the Germplasm Resource Information Network, GRIN, database in countries such as Italy, Greece, and former Yugoslavia. Dr. Q, welcome to Forage Nexus.
Good morning. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Dr. Q, let's start with the question we are always discussing here, right? We want to know who was Dr. Dick Smith, the man behind the giant, and how closely did you work with him, and what was it like to collaborate with him over the past years?
I first met Dick Smith, I believe, while I was a graduate student at the University of Kentucky. There was this group that was known as the Trifolium Conference, which has now been blended in with the National Forage Conference. And there was a meeting held at Lexington there. And so that's where I first met Dr. Smith. He and my major professor, Dr. Norman Taylor, were close collaborators, Norman being in a state position at Kentucky and Dick in an ARS position at Wisconsin. And so that's where I first came to know Dick. And then somewhere along in maybe the early 80s, there was this push by the ARS programs to initiate these crop germplasm committees in various commodities to work with the national germplasm system in laying out priorities for maintenance, distribution, and collection of forage germplasm, and in this case, particularly the Trifolium species. And so by that time, I had become a faculty member here in Florida. I became a member of that committee along with Dick and Dr. Taylor. And so had those close associations. And then when I reached the point where I was eligible for sabbatical, I began looking at places, and certainly Dr. Smith's program at Madison looked like a good place, and did a sabbatical with him for 6 months in 1987. Got to know Dick and his program very closely, more closely, both from a research standpoint and from a personal standpoint. My wife and his wife became fast friends in the antique collecting world and those kinds of things. And Dick and I did a fair amount of traveling around over the state of Wisconsin, looking at plots at Marshfield and all the way up to Lake Superior at the program up there. So I got to know him quite well personally as well. He was an avid outdoorsman, liked being out and around. He was not a scientist who did most of his work sitting in the office. He wanted to be out looking at plots and knowing and understanding. He enjoyed fishing. One of the things I remember is along in the late summer, he had a boat, and he took us out on Lake Mendota there in Madison, and got my wife up on some water skis there. And you know, the lakes in Minnesota, even in August, the temperature is not the lakes in Florida. So it was chilly, but we certainly had a good time with him.
So Dr. Q, Dr. Smith was a pioneer in techniques that fundamentally improved clover persistence and productivity. From your perspective, what is the most important contribution that he had to forage agriculture, and how did they shape the way we use clovers today?
Good question. I think Marcelo, that you mentioned it in the opening comments. Most people considered red clover in the 50s or so as a biennial. You plant it one year, you get a flush of growth, you get some production the next year, and it's pretty well gone after 2 years. And so they were looking for improved persistence, long-term persistence. Both he and Dr. Taylor at Kentucky, Dick with the more strongly dormant material for northern Wisconsin, and Norman with the more kind of mid-dormant material in the transition zone, but looking for materials that would persist 3, 4, maybe even up to 5 years in stands. And so I would say that was probably one of his primary contributions, primarily using recurrent mass selection or recurrent genetics selection as well. And so those would be, I'd say, major contributions that would be looked at. I think several of the private forage breeding companies utilized a germplasm developed by Dr. Smith that got incorporated into modern cultivars as well.
Let's get into this a little bit, Dr. Q. How did they do this? How was the process?
Okay. My understanding, and of course I wasn't there, but I know from my associations and working with Dr. Taylor, is that much of that selection work was just what I call good old-fashioned field plant breeding, in that they were putting out fairly large populations of improved material, probably abusing them a little bit to put them under as much stress as possible, and then selecting and identifying individual clones, individual red clover plants, and then bringing those back together, typically using bee pollination cages. So you bring in 50 to 100 individual plants under a pollination cage, intercross those plants, and then take the seed from that intercross and move that through another cycle of selection to improve the persistence. And in some cases, I think they went out to old farmer fields and identified superior individuals and brought those back into the populations as well.
And actually, that process also had a profound impact and that philosophy had a profound impact in your career, because you were known as the red clover, the clover guru of the South here too, right?
Well, thank you. Yes, we use some of that same philosophy in the development of the non-dormant red clovers here for the Deep South, and started with populations and then identified plants that gave us very early spring production, and then good production on into the summer.
So, Dr. Q, all of this germplasm and the work that he did, he was deeply involved in germplasm collection, as you mentioned. But he also worked with other countries, and he collected hundreds of new accessions. How significant was this work for the clover improvement per se, but here in the U.S., both in the U.S. and internationally?
Well, I would say it was very important. Just mention that the genus Trifolium is known to contain somewhere in the range of 250 different species. Red clover just being one of those. White clover, red clover, crimson, berseem would probably be the primary ones that are used in agriculture. But being part of this clover crop germplasm committee group, that group was charged with looking at the status of the U.S. collections and determining where the voids were, what species needed to be collected, what additional germplasm did not exist in there, and then making proposals to the USDA national system for germplasm collection expeditions to go to the locations where these might be available. So a couple of these involved Dr. Taylor, particularly the one in Yugoslavia. I remember distinctly when they returned from that, he and Dr. Taylor talking about the fact that this was about the time that Yugoslavia was breaking up under the communist influence, and that the various sub-entities of Yugoslavia were not necessarily friendly with each other, and that they were fortunate to be there at a time where they could get in and do collections because they were afraid that there was going to be some political controversy, which turned out to be true, and they're not able to get back into those countries. And then that same crop germplasm group suggested that with a breakup of the communists in Bulgaria, that was a country that was void, and Dr. Gerald Ray Smith and myself and then Gary Peterson made 2 different trips to Bulgaria doing the same type of work, following up with, and that was part of Dr. Smith's recommendations, that there was a country where we ought to go into.
So, Dr. Q, we know the importance of this germplasm and the forage breeding and all that. Then we released the cultivar. How was red clover used, and how was the farmer interaction with this new crop that now all of a sudden it became a good forage option for them?
I think there were probably two principal applications that in the upper Midwest and then in the transition zone that you saw. Some of the work at the Dairy Forage Center showed pretty clearly that inclusion of red clover in a dairy ration would improve retention of protein in the rumen. So you got more bypass protein into the true stomach. So that was one of the things. So they tried to encourage dairy people to incorporate more red clover into dairy diets. And then in the transition zone, there was a lot of work done in the 60s and 70s on fescue pasture renovations. This was before we really understood the fescue endophyte, but it was well understood that inclusion of particularly red clover in a renovated fescue could eliminate some of the fescue toxicity symptoms that they were seeing. And so there's a good bit of work on no-till seeding and other applications of using red clover in the renovating fescue pastures.
So did you guys also get into this with farmers? How was his interaction with the extension side of it? Because you just mentioned the red clovers and the fescue belt, and being in Tennessee now for a little bit, I understand the need of it. I understand the benefits, but even nowadays we still need to convince farmers to do it, right? Because clovers are always seen as something that it won't last long and I need to plant again. If I need to kill my weeds, clovers will be an issue. How was that on the 70s and the 80s? I'm curious now.
Well, it certainly was an issue and continues to be. You hit it right on the head. As you're aware, the weed issue on establishing pastures is always an issue, and that's one of the reasons that we got involved with the development of the 2,4-D tolerant material here in Florida was for that. But go back and look at that. I think both Dr. Taylor and Dr. Smith were quite heavily involved with that, both of the extension specialists. And again, Dick being an ARS employee, he interacted closely with the extension specialist at Madison, in the agronomy department at Madison. And while I was there on sabbatical, I know we did one field day out at the research center at Arlington there, just outside of Madison, a farmer field day looking at the red clover plots and the improvements in persistence.
It's awesome.
So we talk about Dr. Smith's career and his prominence in science and his contributions. How was he like a person? What did he enjoy to do outside of work? And you mentioned water skiing and boating. And then how did he balance that career with family and work-life balance, family and personal life?
I think Dick did a really good job of that. He had, I could be wrong, 3 or 4 children, which we interacted with a good bit because they were becoming young adults when we were there. They had a group of folks who had a summer lake house up on one of the little lakes there just north of Madison. It was a priority that they would take a 2-week summer trip up to the lakes and spend some time on the lakes there. As I said, he had a boat and they did some fishing and other things. They liked winter outside activities as well. I think he did some cross-country snowshoeing and so forth in the wintertime. I don't know whether he did ice fishing, but I suspect he did there on the lakes around Madison. And then, Dick was always very involved with professional activities, but I think he, like I have tried to do, incorporated his professional life and his family into that as much as possible. There was probably 15 or 20 years, there were the 3 of us would be Dick Smith and his wife Shirley, Norma Taylor and Evelyn, and then myself and my wife Joyce. The national meetings, it was just a given. We were all going to the national meetings, and the women would go off and do their thing. And then generally we'd assign the women to find out where we're going to have dinner for the night, and we'd be out having a nice dinner during the international meetings.
That's great. I think that's something that Marcelo and I have been trying to do as well, to go to the meetings and enjoying it and bring family every once in a while. It's always a good time to do this. Mm-hmm. But Dr. Q, Dr. Smith mentored many young scientists and was known as a generous colleague. What qualities made him such a great and effective mentor and leader in the community?
That's a good question. I would say just an interest in people. He was very much a people person. And so he was always concerned that people succeed. There were a couple of master students who were in the lab when I was there on sabbatical that went on and did well. Dr. Wayne Parrott was one of his students who's had a very successful career at Georgia. And so just that love and concern for people and for seeing people succeed. And I think Dick was always one who was looking, where's the future? We don't just need to be training people to do what we're doing, but to be looking for the future of what's the next good thing coming. And that somewhat relates to the comments that I made earlier regarding the development of the red clover population that has high frequency regeneration from tissue culture. That was really before genetic transformation was a big thing, but he was looking for that opportunity so that we would have clover germplasm that would be amenable to the new genetic transformation technologies and could be used in that. And in fact, it has been used for a number of applications, primarily looking at the phytoestrogens, the work at Kentucky with phytoestrogens and red clover, and several other applications have used that population.
Dr. Q, as we approach the end of the conversation about Dr. Smith, I think one of the questions Bruno and I like the most to ask our guests is, what message if Dr. Smith could speak to the younger generation today of forage agronomists, what advice do you think he would give them? What message he would give them as they start their careers in plant breeding and agricultural research to serve for their future?
That's tough. I have to be careful that it's not me speaking for what my advice would be. I think Dick's primary advice would be to look for the future, look for what are the factors, and I think that's kind of where he was with red clover. The limiting factor was persistence. So look at what the limiting factor is, and then determine, can you, is there possibility for genetic variability or other methods to overcome some of those limitations. And then, as we've talked about, don't get totally absorbed in the science and your work, but always remember to take time for your family.
Dr. Quesenberry, thank you so much for sharing your memories, and helping us to honor the legacy of Dr. Richard Dick Smith, a true giant of forage agriculture.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Q, and thank our listeners for joining us today with the Forage Nexus podcast. As we wrap up the series of episodes on the giants of forage agriculture, we'll keep on bringing a few more that are recognized every year. We also invite our listeners to check our other podcasts from the UFI's Forage team, Cow Talks, and Bruno from the University of Tennessee, Livestock.
Yeah, we have both, and thank you all so much for being here with us. I'm Bruno Pedreira, Forage Specialist and Director of the Beef and Forage Center with the University of Tennessee.
And I'm Marcelo, Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist and Associate Program Leader at the University of Florida.
We hope to see you all in the next episode and sometime in one of our podcasts. Thank you all.
Thank you. Dr. Richard Smith's career demonstrated the value and commitment for long-term research projects, as real change normally takes time to happen. He was a forward-thinking, dedicating a lot of his life to the collection of germplasm and improving genetics of white clover. This created the base not only for his program, but also for colleagues across our nation. He was also a very good citizen, willing to take more than the job description. He was an excellent mentor to young scientists and had impacted the life of many of our colleagues. He was very active in professional organizations, including serving as founding member and chair of the Clover and Special Purpose Legume Crop Germplasm Committee of the National Plant Germplasm Systems. And he was named Fellow of both Crop Science Society of America and American Society of Agronomy. In 2019, Dr. Richard Dick Smith was posthumously recognized as a giant of forage agriculture by his colleagues of the C6 Forages and Grazinglands Division of the Crop Science Society of America. He passed away in 2018 at age 82, but his legacy survives. Through the mentees he advised through his career, the germplasm created, and the many clover cultivars released. This podcast was brought to you by the University of Florida Forage Team and the University of Tennessee Beef and Forage Center, with financial support from the Forages and Grazinglands Foundation and technical support from the University of Florida, College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, Faculty Instructional Resources and Support Team. This episode was produced by Marcelo Wallau, Olivia Mauli, Bruno Pedreira, and Ashley Kanabroski. Thank you for joining us on this Forage Nexus podcast. Until next time, keep growing knowledge and keep grazing forward.